Welcome back to our news bulletin. The US says Pakistan's military leaders have reaffirmed their support for peace in Afghanistan. After US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and General Scott Miller's meeting with Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa in Islamabad, the US Embassy said the military renewed its commitment to advance a political settlement to the conflict in Afghanistan. The top US officials' visit comes a day after they met Taliban representatives in Doha and discussed the ongoing peace efforts in Afghanistan. Earlier, Khalilzad urged the Afghan government and the Taliban to accelerate efforts to meet targets specified in the Doha peace agreement. In Pakistan, a soldier has been martyred in an exchange of fire between security forces and terrorists in the northwestern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. In a statement, the military's media wing said the terrorists opened fire after the security forces cordoned an area in North Waziristan. On Monday, security forces killed 2 terrorists in a shootout with terrorists in North Waziristan. A soldier was martyred in the exchange of fire. More from Pakistan. Prime Minister Imran Khan has announced a 2-week extension to the partial lockdown across the country to stem the spread of the coronavirus. But he said curbs on the construction industry would be eased from today. Addressing the media in Islamabad, the Prime Minister urged people to continue adopting precautionary measures. Separately, the Prime Minister discussed the coronavirus crisis with German Chancellor Angela Merkel over the phone. He said, the ability of developing countries to cope with the COVID-19 challenge depends on providing urgent debt relief to them. He hoped that the UN Secretary General, along with Germany, would take up the issue in the forthcoming G20 finance ministers meeting. There are over 5,700 confirmed COVID-19 cases in Pakistan, with 96 deaths and nearly 1,400 recoveries. In the United Kingdom, the coronavirus death toll has surged past 12,000 after another 778 people died in the last 24 hours. Earlier, Spain announced 567 new deaths in a day, but the country reported its lowest increase in the number of cases since 18th March. Iran also saw a decline in the number of daily deaths, raising hopes that the virus could be curbed soon in the country. However, the United States is struggling to flatten the curve, as the number of COVID-19 related deaths surpassed 23,000. Despite the continuous surge in the number of infections, 10 US states are planning to lift stay-at-home orders. Globally, the virus has claimed more than 120,000 lives, with over 1.9 million infections. Moving on to Indian-occupied Kashmir, where the government has extended total clampdown under the pretext of coronavirus spread. The Indian forces have so far arrested over 50 Kashmiri civilians this month for allegedly violating curfew in the valley. In a notice, New Delhi's said containment approach in the occupied territory includes 100% lockdown. It said the complete restriction on any movement across the valley will be imposed, imprisoning civilians in their homes. The curfew and internet ban have already made it extremely hard for Kashmiri doctors to fight the virus. The valley has been reeling under Indian curfew and communications blackout for the last 254 days. Meanwhile, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom has condemned attacks on Muslims in India over COVID-19. The Indian media and government have been blaming Muslims for spreading the virus across the country. In a statement, the Commission criticized the continued scapegoating and attacks of Muslims in India due to false rumors. It said, these attacks are often accompanied by dangerous rhetoric by politicians. The religious freedom body said this stigmatization can breed further discrimination and violence in India. Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has announced to extend countrywide curfew until May 3rd. On March 21st, Modi imposed a sudden clampdown, plunging the country into panic, migrant crisis, and essentials shortage. In Myanmar, officials and residents of Rakhine State have accused the military of killing 8 people in the firing. Myanmar Army has rejected the allegations, saying it has no information on such an incident. The local authority said the incident happened in village of Kayuksik in Ponagyon township of the state. Witnesses said the army opened fire at the villagers over unknown reasons, killing 3 members of the same family. Myanmar's army is facing a hearing at the World Court over a 2017 massacre that led to an exodus of over 7.5 million Rohingya Muslims to neighboring Bangladesh. The forces of warlord Khalifa Haftar rained rockets on Tripoli after being ousted by government loyalists from a string of towns to its west. Earlier, Libya's UN-recognized government said it seized control of 5 more cities from Khalifa Haftar's eastern army. Several homes were hit around Mitiga Air Base in the eastern suburbs, the capital's functioning airport. There was no immediate word on casualties. The UN-recognized government has accused Haftar's forces of taking revenge for their losses on Monday. The capture of the coastal towns of Sorman and Sabratha was seen as a major blow to Haftar. The UN says hundreds have been killed and more than 200,000 displaced since Haftar launched his battle for Tripoli last year. Iraq says it has killed 23 ISIS militants in clashes in the northern Kirkuk province. The military says fierce clashes ensued after the troops found an ISIS hideout cave in the rural area. It said an Iraqi security member was killed and 4 others were wounded in the clashes. Earlier, Iraq's paramilitary Shabi forces said they killed 7 ISIS fighters in the Kurk area of Kirkuk. The Iraqi military announced to resume operation against ISIS in late January after escalation in attacks. The US-led coalition has been working with the Iraqi military in these operations. 1 civilian has been killed and 5 others wounded after an explosive device went off in Syria's central Hama province. State media accused Turkey-backed rebels of planting the device in Khashabia area. It said dozens of people have been either killed or wounded by similar blasts in formerly rebel-held areas. Last week, Syria said the rebels have renewed their attacks on civilians in the northern countryside of Aleppo province. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his rival Benny Gantz have been given 2 more days to reach a deal on a unity government. The extension was approved by President Reuven Rivlin minutes after Gantz's 4-week mandate to form a government expired. In a joint statement, Gantz's Blue and White Alliance and Netanyahu's Likud Party said significant progress has been made towards a deal. The statement said the 2 leaders held direct talks to finalize a deal for an emergency government. Without a deal, it will be up to the parliament to pick a candidate who would then have 14 days to form a government. Failure of forming a government will automatically trigger a snap election, which will be Israel's 4th in a year. Seoul says North Korea has launched multiple short-range cruise missiles into the sea between the Korean peninsula and Japan. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff claimed Pyongyang fired surface-to-ship cruise missiles into the Japan Sea for 40 minutes. Joint Chief of Staff said the missiles flew about 150 kilometers in the drill involving several military aircrafts. The officials at South Korea and U.S. intelligence were analyzing the latest launch in a series of recent weapons tests. North Korea test-fired 9 short-range ballistic missiles and other weapons in March amid stalled nuclear talks with the U.S. Turkey says it will continue with its weekend curfews to stem the spread of the coronavirus. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that the next curfew will be on April 18th and 19th. He said Turkey will complete the construction of a new hospital for COVID-19 patients in Istanbul's Başakşehir by May 15th. Erdogan announced the establishment of 2 new hospitals with a total of 350 beds in Istanbul. The Turkish president ruled out any borrowing arrangement with the IMF during the pandemic. The country has over 61,000 infection cases with nearly 1,300 deaths. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow may draw on the defense ministry's resources to tackle the coronavirus crisis if needed. Speaking at a meeting with senior officials, Russian President said the situation has been constantly changing due to the spread of the virus. He said the next few weeks will prove decisive in the battle to halt the contagion. Putin also said Russia might need to call in the army to help tackle the coronavirus crisis.
Ministry of Defense service members are working quite effectively abroad, helping our colleagues abroad fight this infection. They have considerable experience working in difficult conditions. It's necessary to use this experience, of course, but keep in mind that all the capabilities, including the capabilities of the Russian Ministry of Defense, if necessary, can be and should be deployed here.
More confirmed COVID-19 cases have been found in 3 Arab countries, including Bahrain, Oman, and Libya, in the last 24 hours. Nearly 2 million cases have been reported in 185 countries since December, when the virus was first detected in Wuhan, China. More in this report.
The health authorities said 86 new cases raised the national total to 813 in Oman. At least 4 people have died while 130 have recovered to date. Bahrain, on the contrary, diagnosed 63 new virus cases, bringing the tally to 1,392, of which 591 have recovered. In total, the Gulf nation has had 7 virus-linked deaths. In Libya, 1 more person tested positive for coronavirus, raising the total number of cases to 26. The war-torn country has reported only 1 death so far, while at least 9 patients have recovered. The number could be much higher, but the government lacks adequate testing capacity.
We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. The Southeast Asian leaders have agreed to launch a coordinated fight against COVID-19 pandemic. Leaders of ASEAN member countries made the pledge at a virtual summit chaired by the Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong termed pandemic gravest public health crisis in 100 years. Loong said it's critical for ASEAN to mount a united response. He said none of the countries in ASEAN can be truly safe unless the entire region is safe due to the region's high connectivity. The association's members also agreed to ensure regional supply chains remain open. To address urgent needs of member states during the pandemic, the ASEAN leaders have agreed to establish a joint fund and medical stockpile. China says there is no discrimination going on against Africans in the country. Beijing has rejected U.S. accusations of mistreatment of Africans in Guangzhou as an attempt to harm China's relations with African nations. During a daily briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said China's friendly policy towards Africa has not changed, and neither will be the friendship. In recent days, Africans in Guangzhou claimed they were rejected from their apartments by their landlords. Zhao said the local authorities have conducted an investigation and rolled out a series of new measures to deal with the issue. Officials say a total of 111 Africans in southern Guangzhou city have tested positive for the coronavirus as of Monday. U.S. President Donald Trump is known for his bellicosity against media organizations and personnel critical of him and his government. Now, with the COVID-19 outbreak in the U.S. going from bad to worse, this behavior has reached new heights. Let's find out more in this report.
This past weekend, the New York Times published a story saying President Trump was slow to respond to the COVID-19 threat in the US, despite repeated warnings from the health officials of a viral outbreak in the country. When given the opportunity to defend himself at a recent press conference, the US president gave a very familiar response.
So the story in the New York Times was a total fake. It's a fake newspaper, and they write fake stories. And someday, hopefully in 5 years when I'm not here, those papers are all going out of business because nobody's going to want to read them. But now they like them because they write about me.
When pressed further for a more tangible evaluation of his government's handling of the coronavirus crisis by a CBS reporter, President Trump became openly hostile, accusing the network and its reporter of being part of the same conspiracy as the Times.
Look, you know you're a fake. You know that your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake.
Media bashing isn't anything new for the US president. In fact, he's been using this tactic to defend himself since his 2016 election campaign. Now, Trump stands confronted with a historic crisis in the midst of an election year.
We've done this right, and we really have done this right. The problem is the press doesn't cover it the way it should be.
And he lashed out at everything from media to the World Health Organization and Chinese government to defend himself. How far this strategy goes with the bodies piling up in record numbers in the US remains to be seen.
A U.S. Navy sailor has died after contracting the coronavirus on the U.S. aircraft carrier THEODORE Roosevelt. This comes after the carrier's captain was fired for raising alarm about his crew's vulnerability to the virus.
The deceased sailor, whose name is being withheld by the US government for now, is the first active service member to succumb to the COVID-19 pandemic. A statement from the US Navy said he had tested positive for the virus on 30th March. He was moved to intensive care on the 9th of April after being found unresponsive in his quarters. 12% of the THEODORE Roosevelt's crew of 4,600 have tested positive for the virus. Last month, the aircraft carrier's former commander, Brett Crozier, had written a letter to the Navy asking for the Roosevelt to be evacuated and sanitized. This was eventually leaked to the public, leading to Crozier's firing and the resignation of Acting Navy Secretary Thomas Maudley. There has been a massive backlash in the US against the Navy's decision to remove Crozier from his post rather than heeding his warning.
The death toll from storms and tornadoes that ravaged the U.S. southern states has risen to 30. Officials say as many as 60 tornadoes ripped through Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, while severe storms hit parts of Alabama, Georgia, and Carolinas. Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi have declared an emergency as residents struggle with stay-at-home orders caused by COVID-19. Authorities reported 11 deaths in Mississippi, 9 in South Carolina, and 8 in Georgia, while 2 people died in Tennessee. The National Weather Service says the storm punctured roofs, turned over mobile homes, and downed power lines. The storms have left over 1 million customers without electricity. Democratic Republic of Congo has recorded a third new Ebola case after over 7 weeks without any new infection. The World Health Organization said a 7-year-old girl started showing symptoms after visiting the same health center as the 2 previous cases. The WHO said the girl has a good chance of survival. The global health body said all 3 new cases had visited the Horizon Healthcare Center in Beni. Congo was due to mark an end to the second deadliest outbreak of the virus until a new case emerged in Beni last week. The outbreak has killed more than 2,000 people since August 2018 in Congo, where militia violence hindered efforts to contain it. The UN has warned more than 117 million children can miss out on immunization against measles due to COVID-19 pandemic restrictions. The UN Health Agency said measles immunization campaign in 24 countries have already been delayed and more will be postponed. In a statement, the UNICEF said social distancing piles pressure on health services, putting children in 37 countries at risk. It urged leaders to intensify efforts to track unvaccinated children to provide the most vulnerable populations with measles vaccines as soon as possible. The UN Fund said delivering all immunization services, including measles vaccines, is essential to saving lives. According to the World Health Organization, measles infected 10 million people in 2018 and killed 140,000, mostly children. Ukraine says wildfire raging through forests around the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant has been put out. Officials said hundreds of emergency workers used planes and helicopters to douse the flames. Authorities said radiation level remained within normal limits and additional protective measures were not required. But they said short-term spikes in cesium-137 particles were registered in the Kiev area to the south of the plant. Earlier, environmental activists warned the fire near the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster in 1986 posed a radiation risk. The fire began on April 3rd in the western part of the exclusion zone and spread to nearby forests. Antarctica is the only continent in the world that has not reported novel coronavirus cases, and Chile is working to keep it that way. Chile's Navy Commander Alejandro Valenzuela Pena said scientific encampments across the continent remain under isolation within isolation. Pena said the end of the tourist season on March 3rd enabled them to contain the spread of the virus in Antarctica. Director of Chile's Antarctic Institute, Marcelo Lepe Cartes, said outbreak on an Antarctic base would be devastating.
We have had a lot of discussion about the potential damage that the expansion of COVID-19 could cause in Antarctic territory, and we believe that it could obviously be devastating for a base. We don't have the hospital capacity that the other countries have. Nevertheless, I think there is a positive point here that if an infection were to occur in the Antarctic base, the contact between bases is very sporadic, very infrequent, with long distances and time between each other, obviously very long distances.
Scientists have discovered most powerful supernova ever. Astronomers led by University of Birmingham and Harvard observed explosion for 2 years and recorded their findings in the peer-reviewed journal. Scientists said this type of a supernova is an extremely rare celestial event. They said it occurs only when stars with extremely large mass undergo violent pulsations before they die, shaking off a giant gas shell. According to the study, this supernova was 10 times stronger and about 500 times brighter than a normal supernova. We're taking a short break and we'll be back with more news. Stay tuned. For our top business story, we look at the global economy, which the IMF says is expected to contract by 3% this year as governments grapple with the COVID-19 crisis worldwide. In a report, the monetary body described the global economic downturn as the worst since the Great Depression. More in this report.
The IMF said the crisis could knock $9 trillion of the global GDP over the next 2 years. The report adds global debt is expected to increase significantly over the next year, while moratoriums on debt payments and debt restructuring may need to be continued as the world economy emerges from lockdown. At a press conference, Chief IMF economist Geeta Gopinath said, while downside risks prevail, debt-to-output levels will stabilize as the economies recover. Earlier, the IMF approved an immediate debt relief to 25 member countries under its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. The list includes most African countries with the exception of Yemen, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Haiti. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said the 6-month relief will help the countries fight the COVID-19 pandemic.
France's Foreign Minister Bruno Le Maire says the country's economy is set to contract a staggering 8% this year, revising government's outlook for the second time in a week. The minister said the budget deficit is also set to rise record 9% of the GDP. Last week, Bank of France said the economy contracted 6% in the first quarter amid lockdown due to COVID-19. It is the biggest quarterly contraction since World War II, surpassing the previous record of over 5% in 1968 due to civil unrest. Statistics Office INSEE also estimated that the lockdown has slashed France's overall economic activity by 35%. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro says his country and the U.S. are set to implement more intensified trade between the two nations. In a Twitter post, he said the members of the Commission on Economic and Trade Relations will meet next week to deepen the areas of the U.S.-Brazil agreement. Earlier, Brazilian Foreign Minister Ernesto Araújo said U.S. Ambassador Robert Lighthizer spoke to discuss improving bilateral trade. In early March, Brazil signed a pact to strengthen military ties with the U.S. Wall Street stocks have risen on signs that some economies would ease strict coronavirus lockdowns. The markets bolstered as the investors are looking at quarterly earnings from JP Morgan Chase and Johnson & Johnson. The profits of JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo plunged in the first quarter as both banks set aside billions of dollars to cover loan losses. The major bourses traded in positive territories. The shares of Tesla surged nearly 13%, giving the Nasdaq a boost. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.